Welcome to Canterbury Trails, a weekly walk through the faith and culture of our Anglo heritage.
O Lord, our Heavenly Father,
England is first and foremost for us a home.
That which we are.
Forth now, fear no darkness.
One equal temper of heroic hearts.
grant that all our doings may be ordered by thy governance.
It's the man who's only thinking about doing a good job or telling the truth who becomes really original.
Made weak by time and fate, but strong in will.
And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, for the joy of battle was on them.
To strive, to seek, to find.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
And not to yield.
You have got to be happy in those quiet moments when you remember that you are alive.
Amen.
Well, welcome to another episode of Canterbury Trails. Today we are discussing with a guest some elements of Western metaphysics, nominalism, realism, and all of the works. This is a great topic to have a guest for because I can actually relax and let Jared and Tom Price, our guest, do most of the hard work here. So Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Good. Well, I think a lot of this conversation, or at least the initial bit, is going to be based on a talk that you gave at a conference hosted by Jared's church 2 years ago, I think. So some of this material this is not new territory for you or Jared. But I guess, Jared, if you want to kind of set things up, maybe talk a little bit about why you were motivated to have this discussion. Some people think this is just kind of like out of date, esoteric, has nothing to do with, the actual needs of the church or religious development, but there is a reason for it. So maybe we could start with that, Jared.
Yeah, so this comes from a talk that probably should be linked on the show notes page at the end from our conference in 2024, October of 2024 on I think it was called Recovering Babylon was the talk, something along that line. But you talked about, the development of Western thought, especially in regard to voluntarism, the rise of voluntarism, nominalism, and the emphasis on the will over against nature. Yeah. And so this is, I think, a really, really, really important topic that I keep coming around to again and again over the past couple of years to understand, to really understand natural law and understand the classical Christian tradition. We have to understand natures and get the idea of will, or at least put will in its right place. Yeah. And I think too often there are a lot of Christians who are spooked by the idea of natural law. Yeah. And I think part of it is, I've heard people say this actually, that the natural law is just a wax nose, which implies that it's a product of will. Like you just take natural law and just conform it, and it's whoever has the power can make natural law into whatever they want, because they're still thinking fundamentally in these categories of will. Mm-hmm. So I remember from this talk, I was thinking about it the other week, and I remember talking to you at the conference saying, boy, I would like to do more on what you touched on in that short period of time. And so I thought, well, we might as well. I think the conversation at the time was something like having you back to do more. I thought, well, if nothing else, we'll get it out there on the podcast and give you more time to expand on this whole idea of or ideas of ontological transcendence, the rise of voluntarism, and then, of course, the influence of Islam and nominalism coming out of that. And so I would like to actually kind of begin with nominalism. It is a word that's thrown around a lot, and I think oftentimes misunderstood. I'm not trying to reclaim it. I'm not a nominalist in any sense, but if anybody has read Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, he really hammers nominalism a lot. There's a more recent book, the Benedict Option by, what's his name?
Is that Rod Dreher's work? Or it's one of those. Yeah,
I was blanking out on the name.
Yeah,
but he kind of sets that book up as well as everything beginning with nominalism, and so I want to talk about what is nominalism as opposed to realism, and kind of flesh out that story of wills and acts of the will in competition with one another. And even by the end of it, it'd be nice to get into how does this influence maybe some of our understanding of Reformed theology, and how we articulate it in terms of man's will and God's will and those sorts of things that might complicate things that weren't as complicated for the classical Christian understanding of these concepts.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. And you're right, by way into that subject, that, a lot of times these, metaphysics and ontology, they sound like these things that are very removed from us because we don't use that terminology to think about them as contemporaries. But we do recognize that there are problems going on that we don't know how to address. As you mentioned, I mean, just think of the whole trans debate, on what is the nature of human sexuality, the relationship of the body to human nature. Is there an essence there? And is there something more than just a construct that we're projecting onto reality? That is really a long way down, echo of what went wrong a long time ago. And we're just starting to deal with it. And one of the reasons we're dealing with it is because Christians have stopped knowing how to think and talk about it in many ways and be salt and light in those arenas in which those discussions are going on and where people are making decisions that are problematic because of bad views of reality and bad understandings of, like you said, natures and things. So if we go back, I would say to what we kind of talked the medieval period after the patristic period, what you had was a lot of hard theological work that really worked hard to draw out the implications of the Christian doctrine of God in conversation with all the different sciences and philosophy. It wasn't afraid of philosophy. It had positioned philosophy as a great tool and a bad queen, right? And so it understood theology as the queen of things and God is the ultimate reality and first principle of all things. And so it utilized the Hellenic metaphysical traditions, philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Neoplatonism, because they were sciences that dealt with the question of being and they had categories to address it. Of course, Christians didn't do so uncritically, like any science we would use as a Christian, modern science today. We wouldn't do it as a Christian uncritically. We would not look at the world, for example, as though it wasn't created. So creation would be something that informed our relationship to the world. Well, metaphysics was informed by the Christian theological vision. All the way back to, in a strong sense, St. Augustine, I think one of the most fruitful theologians that really set the path of delving into the metaphysical implications, or just another way of putting it, the reality implications of what our conception of God is and then our conception of creation. And so it is from there that we get kind of the high point with different figures, maybe culminating in a figure like Thomas Aquinas, who really represents, I think, almost the height of classical Christian theism and its metaphysic of creation, to which I don't think anyone has really done a lot better than Thomas on those two topics when dealing with these kinds of issues. That doesn't mean Thomas is right about everything. I disagree with Aquinas on transubstantiation and other things. But in talking about the metaphysics of creation, the nature of creation as created and owing all of its reality to the infinite source of all things, God, you can't really do much finer. And I think everything becomes a footnote on that for Christians then. But something happens in this world. So first, let's start with metaphysical realism. What's going on there when we think about that, and what questions are being asked. So you could say, what are universals, for example? That's a core question at the heart of metaphysical realism. And let's just say the debate concerning things like the reality of human nature, the reality of goodness, the reality of justice. Are these real things, ingredient in the fabric of reality in different ways, ultimately finding their fullness and source in God? Or are these things that are just names that we put onto things? We hang on things that aren't built into the fabric of reality, but are just differing individual things that show up in the world that we happen to put names on, and we do it for a whole bunch of reasons, but none of them because there is a real nature ingredient in reality that demands we come up with a concept fitting for it. So you could say classical realism argues that there is a reality there, and it's intelligible. It has stamped into it the differing kinds of things that we hang our language on. And we're hanging language on real things, not just simply constructs. And these real things have a particular character. They're what they would call universals. What do we mean by a universal? Well, a universal is something that is ingredient in the fabric of creation, where they have a genuine reality that is intelligibly distinguished from something else, and that many different real things can share in. For example, I go into a parking lot and there are a bunch of cars, right? Each one of them I can recognize as a car and distinguish it from trees. Now, I know some people today are having a hard time with those kinds of things, but on the whole, as I tell my students, you navigate yourself to school every day. So at least existentially, you're able to distinguish different kinds of realities and categorize them. And the reason is because there is an intelligibility built into these different kinds of things that communicates its goodness to us. And in that communication, it also communicates something beyond the material level, that it participates in something that is more than just what you're experiencing through your senses. Your intelligible mind is able to push through the sense experience and grab a hold of something real in reality and distinguish it. And the reason you can distinguish it is because there are real things, forms, if you will, to use Plato's language, or universal realities, that everything that has an intelligible similarity to that type of thing is built into the fabric of things. Now, it's hard to be able to explain that kind of thing, but the best thing to say is when we deal with something like human nature, we're saying that there really is something beyond my human idea of it, built into reality that I am actually intelligibly discerning and knowing, and everything that fits into that category by experience, you and me and every other human I can meet, are really sharing in something that is universal. So then, by implication, because there is an intelligible reality with its own good there, I owe a certain justice in my relationship to that kind of reality and that kind of good that is universal as well. So if my neighbor, who I don't talk too much, and someone who I have no dealing with, say my enemy, I still owe a certain justice to both of them because of them being human beings made in the image of God. That's something owed to the very kind of reality that's there, whether or not they deserve it or not, right? It's built into the kind of good that they are. And so that is something that gets lost with nominalism. So what, again, classical realism would say that there are real universals. They're not mental constructs. They're not me projecting my names onto reality and my ideas about it. Shared natures exist. When we say that Socrates and Plato are both human, they truly share in something that is real, a human nature that is really there. That the essences that different things share in are intelligible. They communicate their goodness and the type of being they are to us so that we can grasp something of their real being. That's going to become important, because when we look at things like human nature and what they communicate to us, we realize this isn't merely a social understanding we put onto things, but we're receiving a certain nature that has a certain form and function and needs to be related to for us and that to flourish the right way. And that being is structured. Reality has intrinsic purposes built into it, which are part of the fabric of each kind of thing there is. Human beings have a certain kind of what we would call in philosophy a teleology, a purpose, a goal that is the perfection of that particular kind of thing, a human being. And so we have appetites that are hungry for that fulfillment. And if we don't feed the appetite, well, we cause problems. If we don't love things the right way, we cause disorderings, because reality really is structured in a way that when we orient and truthfully enact the kind of natures that we have in accord with their telos, their purpose, they are meant to flourish and fly. When we don't, disorder develops. So there's a lot of cost if we don't have some metaphysic like this. And again, I know this is very technical language. It's what philosophers deal with all the time. But you can imagine when we switch over to what nominalism holds. Basically, it argues that universals have no real existence.
So let me interject with a quick question. What is the motivation of someone like William of Ockham in articulating nominalism? Because I think this is part of the question nobody ever answers. You almost get the image of William of Ockham sitting around saying, how can I mess up the world one day?
Yeah.
Produce something that's going to change civilization for 500 years. So what's he, I would assume he's trying to get at a particular issue or problem in his day. So what is that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And this kind of brings us into the second part of nominalism. It's driven by a theological interest. It was theologically interested. This is why I think Michael Gillespie's good work at the theological origins of modern society, even though he gets some of the details wrong, I think he's right on the antenna. And he basically says modernity, which is the end result of this shift, is a transformation of late medieval theological debates. So Occam, following Scotus, they are interested in preserving divine freedom. They value the divine will to be absolutely free. Otherwise, they're thinking God would be limited by something and therefore wouldn't be, as Scripture teaches, sovereign or free. But the problem is what they were conceiving of as divine freedom. And so this is where the kind of Islamic influence came in. Now, it's a bit of a complicated debate, but let's go back before Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle gets lost from Western philosophy for quite a while and actually becomes discovered by Islamic theologians, Muslims. And they translate it into Arabic, and then they basically bring it into conversation in theological circles with Maimonides and out of Judaism, and Thomas Aquinas and other theologians out of Christianity. But two figures in particular, you had Avicenna and then Averroes, the two Muslim theologians. Well, Avicenna basically took some of the theology of Islam and mixed it with this Aristotelian and kind of Neoplatonic understanding. And he basically rejected the Abrahamic emphasis on creation out of nothing, out of divine freedom and will, and adopted, for logical, philosophical reasons, Aristotle and Neoplatonism, that basically God, everything emanates from the divine out of necessity. So the divine didn't freely create, but necessarily, because the kind of inherent logic of the nature of this being kind of has to overflow. It's a fullness that has to overflow. So it makes creation not the free act of God, but really something that God has to do. And that is problematic. Averroes, though, basically argued that Avicenna had it wrong and had basically imprisoned the divine will within this metaphysical picture that limited God's freedom to be able to create, not be sheer will as Islam understands God to be. Allah is basically understood as just a sheer, inscrutable will. No nature. I mean, even now you talk to a Muslim, they can't understand the love of God, for example. That makes no sense that you would have a nature other than will. And so, but this floods into debates within Christianity, and actually, without intending to, something else happens in the process between Aquinas and Scotus and Occam. Is that being takes on a new definition. Whereas for Aquinas, following classical Christianity from the fathers, God's being is not one more kind of thing like the other kinds of beings that are. When we talk about God's being as simple being and using all that language, we're not trying to just use language to confuse things. What we're trying to do is distinguish the kind of nature God has from everything else. God is not one more piece of the furniture of the universe, and the universe itself is just a collect of a bunch of pieces. It's not the infinite source of all things. And so when we talk about the being of God, sometimes they'll even borrow from Neoplatonism and say being beyond being. But what they're trying to say there is when we're dealing with God, we're dealing with one whose very nature is to be. God is beingness itself, if we could talk metaphysically about God or ontologically. I amness itself, right? The self-existent one is the theological, divine aseity we use in theology. Everything has a nature and a existence that is. I have a human nature, that's what I am as an essence, and then I have existence if I'm an existing human. Take away the existence, I really don't even have a nature, but there's nothing about human existence that says by being a human that I have to exist. How do I know? Because I came into being, I'll go out of being. I don't have to be. With God, it's different. God has to be because God is being. It's the very nature to be, and the opposite of being is non-being, which is not anything. So this is how the classic Christians understood God. So what happens is a shift happens. And God no longer is the infinite plenitude, being itself, that if anything else is, it has as a free donated gift by God, participating in a creaturely way in what God is by nature. It now becomes something, if you will, draw a box, and that's existence. But existence isn't understood as God. It's understood just as a general category that anything exists, shares in. And so now if God exists, God is no longer the plenitude that gives you the box. God now is in the box, but at the top, the most powerful being there is, but in a shared reality of existence, but at the top. Well, already you have a problem because if God is part of the shared fabric with everything else, just the most powerful being, first, this God needs something else to make it be, and it wouldn't be ultimate. But secondly, this God is now having to compete with his will with the rest of the creatures in the same sphere. God has to increase so that we can decrease because God's in the same terrain of being. The Christian view is God's not in the same terrain of being at all. God's the source of it all. So he's not in competition with any of it. So a competitive understanding comes in, and then it gets interpreted through that Islamic thing as sheer will. And so now the divine is the most powerful will within the box at the top. And
where does that turn, take away, where does that come in? Who's responsible for that? Is that Aristotelian kind of chain of being thinking there? Or, I mean, because you refer to the classical Christians having it right. So where does that critical turn where this box ID is at the top of the box?
It comes in with Duns Scotus right before Occam. Really, you get a different. If you look at his definition of being, it begins to change, and this is why you don't have things. You have individual existence, like individual humans that we kind of collectively say are a group, but they're individual existence. They don't share in the same fabric of being and therefore a same universal. They just share like anything else that is as an individual in this general category of existence. Now, it gets tricky what he means by that. But it does, that shift does happen. But the emphasis on will basically comes about because of that Islamic strand. But let me compare it to what went before in Christianity. In Christianity, with Aquinas, Augustine, when we talk about God's will, God is not simply just will. God is the infinite plenitude of perfect perfection, which means anything that exists in our world, God is in a complete way. So intelligibility, wisdom, beauty, goodness, all these things are what God is by nature, and every creaturely thing gets to share in it, as it is in its distinct creatureliness. So God is an infinite plenitude where intelligence, or a divine wisdom and divine will are part of what it means to be the divine nature. But what happens with Aristotle in this Islamic interpretation, and then the rejection of it by Averroes, is that he begins to say, well, wait a minute, in God, if divine intelligibility and reason somehow is part of God's nature that limits the will or freedom, then God is almost a prisoner to his own nature and isn't free. And so they want to break out any kind of limit, even the very limit of God's so-called goodness or wisdom. And so this is why, you have nihilism is defined as beyond good and evil, right? Why? Because you're dealing with sheer will that can, whatever it chooses, whether it's good or evil, because there isn't any way to measure it. And so you get really you can see how modern nihilism grows right out of sheer voluntarism, because it's premised by no nature, whereas classic Christianity, God's goodness and God's will are one and the same. There is no willing that isn't even the perfect expression of divine wisdom and intelligibility and divine goodness. The will in God, these things are not dividable, and they're not, God doesn't have to compete, and there's no limit because God is perfectly all these things. Infinite wisdom and infinite freedom go hand in hand. But there had already been an alteration in the imagination, and so it became competitive. So you get the nature of God, anything apart from will, to limit it out of the picture. You redefine God almost as sheer will. That's what God's nature is. Then you begin to put God at the top of a shared box, and God becomes the most imposing will in the box and becomes a threat to everything rather than the source of all its being and goodness. And it becomes a threat to human freedom in a sense, because it's either the divine will imposing itself arbitrarily on me, or me, Prometheus, like with my fist raised saying, no, wait a minute, I'm going to assert my will. And this is where you get a lot of the problematic theological stuff that the Reformation had to deal with, whose will's going to win out, right? Whereas classically, divine will was good for us. We knew it was, because in truthfully enacting our creatureliness, which God wanted us to do, we didn't have to decrease so God increased. We weren't even on the same chain of reality. So we're sourced to do everything we do, and it's to God's good pleasure. So a lot of things happen in that change, but with it, the whole tapestry of reality, its intelligibility, its interconnectedness, and the way in which our reason and faith were more harmoniously related, natural law, divine law were more harmoniously related. They weren't competitions with, they were actually creaturely participations in the divine law. Reason is nothing more than a creaturely sharing in divine wisdom. It's not in competition with it.
Right. And I think that's how Aquinas talks about, God acts with an end in view, like we all do, a purposeful being. And as a purposeful being, his behaviors conform to his end.
Yeah.
As opposed to just, he can do whatever he wants. He could make the sun go backward, or make the earth go backwards. But no, he has an end.
Yeah.
His glory ultimately, and his means conform to that end, and thus natural law is a kind of participation in that divine, reason, I should say. Natural law, or participation in that divine nature and divine will, right? And the will's understood as a means toward that end. You know, he acts in accordance with an end. Right.
That's right. And so all of natural reality finds its beginning, sustenance, and source in God. It's oriented to God as a creature. It receives its being at even the fallen person receives its being at every moment from the Creator. There is no creature that doesn't have a relationship with God. There is no autonomous sphere that can stand on its own from the creaturely realm. And this is where it gets wild, because actually we know evil doesn't have an ontology itself. It depends on being in order to be. And it depends on the goodness of the creature in order to be, just like a cancer depends on a healthy cell. And so there is this great loss that happens when we start to lose this, but we lose the sacramental vision of reality as well, because all creation manifests through its visibility something of the invisible nature of God. And so each creaturely thing is a refraction of divine light. And, you know, it's part of, you know, I think one of the most interesting, like Maximus the Confessor, one of these figures will talk about the Logos, right, is the one through whom all are made, the illuminating one through all things are known. And it's almost that what you have is each created thing is worded. We could say formed. Worded is another way, a biblical way of putting it. It has logoi, as Maximus says it, and it has a sign character, but that sign is not detached from the divine nor its own inherent reality. They're both connected, so that the material and the divine source that is causing it to be and to which it points to as its source are so intimately connected that everything both has its real nature, but also serves as a sign pointing to God as its source, and it reflects something of the divine source in a way that another creaturely thing cannot do it. That's why we have many creaturely things, each communicating its own goodness. That gets broken here. And so sacrament begins to take on almost an extrinsic character, that the sacrament is outside of the divine reality. It can point the way, you know, a sign does to something that's not around, but it doesn't really share in as the divine reality as its source and end. So a lot gets lost when this break happens, and really you start to get this intense fragmentation. Language now is suspect, because it is simply customary ways of hanging names on things, not discerning realities and doing justice to them. I mean, think of the way a biblical name works in Scripture, right? The name and the reality are mostly interconnected, right? Think of how God self-names. He doesn't, you know, he gives Moses self-names. Reality, who God is and what God is, one and the same. I am is the name. I mean, that's how we translate it. He doesn't say I'm one more piece of the furniture of the universe. He names his reality, the self-existent one. That's who I am. Take Job. Job is a really neat name, right? It's basically one who gets treated badly. It's roughly what his name is. One who is going to be treated like a criminal. If you translate you nominalize the verb, that's what you end up getting there in the Hebrew. And that's what happens to us, the reality for him. But reality is kind of this way. And when we hang names on, even different languages, they're not arbitrary. There is some customary ways that are looser, than what we're doing, but where the language is what Tolkien was onto. Language and reality are much more closely related, than we think, because we've been so impacted by nominalism. But I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question. It's more of a historical, question. Is when I hear all this, when I first kind of waded into the debate, so to speak, it seemed so obvious to me from a Christian view that the answer lies in realism. And I'm just curious, with people like William of Ockham that are so much more brilliant than I am, what may have been the motivation for this? Was it just a trendy thing at the time because of the recovery of Aristotle? Were there political or theological motivations happening?
Yeah.
I'm really trying to pick that up.
Yeah, I think that I didn't clarify it. I think it really was that he felt too that the metaphysical vision of realism was the outgrowth of what he felt was a theology that limited God's freedom. And by saying basically that God had to conform to some kind of rational nature of his own would limit his freedom. And so what he does is he makes things radically contingent. And so making every individual thing dependent on whether God wills it or not is what guarantees God's freedom. But it also creates a more radical view of contingency. Each thing is there because God sheerly wills it, not because God wills it with a wisdom and goodness that can be intelligibly oriented to God, can be expected to have a stable reality that represents everything of its kind. And so you get a hyper focus on individual things that are willed by God. And so he meant to do God justice, that this is God's freedom, and this is because God is the ultimate power. This is what he created with his power, and like it or not, that's what we have. And so, but you can see what happens when that picture starts to move out of, a deeper Christian view of reality in God is power defining what is ultimate. Mm-hmm. God, nature, human nature become defined by will predominantly. I mean, almost look at what wokeism is, right? It's fighting over whose social construct, whose projection of their will onto reality is going to win out. And all reason, follow Foucault, all reason is nothing more than a fraudulent rhetoric used to manipulate people to get them to submit to your reality vision so that you can lord over them, so that your will can be actually the dominant one. So it's dominion theology gone bad, or it's what Augustine called libido dominandi. The lust for dominance is really the only thing that is behind all of our language. Now, to be fair, sometimes it is. We all know that lying exists, but that's what makes it so heinous. Is, political rhetoric, where we know they're sitting there lying to us, and you have a whole bunch of people out there clapping, like, oh, what they say is true. Yeah, this time, but the only way you can measure those things is if there is a reality there to which to measure up those statements. Otherwise, you have contesting wills. And so let's just go back a little bit to the immediate outflow. Reformation had to kind of come in and deal with a lot of this mess. And so the Reformation usually gets implicated in basically bringing the secular world to us, because it runs with a lot of this metaphysic and voluntarism. And you were going to say something, Jared?
Yeah, that's what I was going to go to next. So what do we do with Martin Luther, who's constantly accused of being a nominalist? Just and sinner, how can you be a sinner and justified at the same time? You're just applying nominalism, putting names on things. So, where is that a false accusation, or is there some truth to that? And we'll start with Luther, and then perhaps go to Calvin and some others.
Okay.
How they flesh this out.
How they flesh it.
If you don't mind, Tom, before you get to the answer for that, I really like to remind people who use this that the Catholic-sponsored universities were teaching Martin Luther at the time. Like, that's where this was coming from. It was from the Catholic Church. So I always like to point that out. Yeah. It wasn't like it came out of nowhere because Luther was trying to reject everything.
They were teaching
but
nominalism, you mean.
Yeah.
That's what you meant. Yeah, they weren't teaching Luther. They were teaching Occam.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. I just like to get that out there because
that's right.
It frames the historic situation differently.
Right.
It does. And I think a fair way to put it is that this is the direction within the universities that philosophical and theology debate were going. Like any theology, like we had, post-liberalism, or we have different schools of thought go through the universities and everyone, runs with it. It's funny now, I'm old enough to see everyone who comes out and who are defending positions, they were what we were reading way back when, and the people coming out now think they're the hot item. These things have been going on. But here, what happened is these innovations, they called it the new way, via moderna, the modern theology of its day, modern philosophy. And a lot of Catholics did promote it. And they also, if they didn't promote nominalism per se, and they didn't promote, SCOTUS and voluntarism in those rigorous senses, they did have some alterations that were problematic and distorted Thomas. You had something developed called two-tier Thomism, which is very different than the classic Thomas Aquinas. And you have something called Baroque scholasticism, which is also problematic. That's another show. But it does create a more complicated picture that the Reformation was not trying to come up with a new denomination. It was trying to return Catholicism back to the patristic and biblical roots so that we could get behind where these alterations have, particularly Augustine, which everyone, as much as Aquinas, shared. And if we could get back there, maybe we could start to see where we went wrong. So a lot of the motivation of the reformers, especially Calvin and the others that had more time to think about it, Luther, it was from the gut. I mean, Luther is in the middle of nominalism and he knows something's gone wrong, but he doesn't really know. I mean, he just attacks it as medieval scholasticism, but probably what he had in mind is what he thought medieval scholasticism was, nominalism. And he sees that as creating problems, but he does adopt some nominalism in the process, like we adopt modernism, like it or not, in some of its, worst forms. So, theological voluntarism, just to back up, is makes God's will primary, and God's reason is basically nothing more than the expression of will. So God's will is governed by nothing, not even God's higher nature. Moral laws are good only because God commands them, not because they're in accord with his fullest nature. They're good. Simply, God's the most powerful being, and if he wills it, that's what's going to be good. If he wills it to be good, it's good. And again, this is going to create a little bit of tension, because what God wills today to be good, what if he changes his mind tomorrow? Now, you can say that God doesn't change his character, but we've seen different things in history. What was the big debate between God's absolute will and his ordained will, right? That was the big debate that was going around then. And sometimes his ordained will could change, even though his absolute will didn't. And we can only know the ordained will. We couldn't know the absolute. So everything becomes insecure for us. So what if God chooses to save us by Christ in one aspect of Revelation history, and the next day changes it? It was creating anxiety, and Luther had to get some grip on it. And there was no necessary rational grounding of moral norms independent of the divine will. So we still see this around with some of these excessive divine command theory reformed people, right? Divine will and the divine command theory are what establish things, and reason, if it's going to be used at all in ethical thinking, it's only just to explain the command, not to think about it more than that. So everything's become contingent. Natural law loses its metaphysical grounding, and moral intelligibility of things weakens. So there is an increase of basically an anxiety about salvation. There's a strong emphasis on divine sovereignty and will, and there's a real deep distrust in human capacities. So human reason is looked at very negative. So Luther is in this environment. So what does Luther take? Well, he does adopt something of what I would call, he doesn't mean to, and I think to be fair with him, he probably would share more in common with the classic Christian tradition, but sometimes his view of divine transcendent and will does sound competitive. that it's, you know, law versus grace, as oppositional, and though they occur on the same order of being, right? But that's a byproduct of what happens here. Classically, law and grace wouldn't have been competitive, because they're happening again on different orders of things. That's why with James, you can fully take Galatians and James, and you don't have to throw it out like a epistle of straw, right? But you do get this suspicion of all metaphysics and philosophy. There's an opposition growing between faith and reason, you know, natural law and divine command, metaphysical thinking and scripture. So now we're just going to scriptural modes of reflection, suspicious of anything else culturally or creaturely, and a deep kind of, just a suspicion of the creation itself and its part to play in anything. It's almost that the creation has to radically decrease almost to nothing in order for the divine glory to increase. It's no longer God's creation, but it's, you know, it's so fallen that there's nothing, you know, salvageable about it. So this is the context Luther comes into. And so Luther does share some of it, but I think probably Mike Horton's reading of Luther is much fairer. He does more justice. He basically will say that, Luther was rejecting late medieval nominalism. He didn't want to embrace it. He did remain within the broader Augustinian tradition. He was fleshing out good classic biblical Augustinian theology. And he would have affirmed many of the doctrinal commitments of theological realism, like divine simplicity, these things were embraced by him. But he does bring in some of the problem of, the emphasis on God's will prior to kind of emphasizing other aspects of God's nature. Things are good because God wills it. A sort of suspicion of the created order under the conditions of the fall completely for communicating, morality or reading any kind of natural law. And so you do get some of that there. But I do think Luther was trained in nominalist philosophy. I mean, that's clear. That's what was taught in the universities. It did shape especially Protestant ways of thinking about things, epistemology. That it really impacted that. And the Reformation does kind of go through some strands that do kind of undermine metaphysical realism. And I think we do see that in some of the hyper Puritan strands. I always say in some Presbyterian strands, but I got a lot of Presbyterian friends. But you do see it show up, almost a competitive view of the divine versus the human and creaturely. I was actually in a little class, I'm in the Anglican communion with, you're both Anglican, right? Yeah. I was in a class with someone who is very much on the kind of hyper reform side of the tradition. And when they were talking about the Eucharist in particular, they were really emphasizing just almost an oppositional relationship between the preference of word over sacrament rather than the continuity and relationship between them. And I couldn't help but just smell nominalism all over that, this competitive relation between a creaturely thing and the creator. The fall is what the issue is, not the creaturely nature of it. Realism held that, I think, better than any voluntarism that came after it, even if it preserved divine freedom and the emphasis on divine action. But I think you get a little bit different when you get to Calvin, because I think, again, Calvin, although there are some aspects of Calvin that still have some of the nominalism that they haven't weaned from, he still is another figure returning to scriptural modes and the fathers in particular to help unpack these things. He is sort of suspicious of philosophy, although he In his finer moments, he's not. I mean, even the beginning of the Institutes, if you look at it, I mean, he is right in the tradition, where he talks about where do we begin? Either you can't think of God without thinking of the human, but you can't even think of the human being without thinking of God. And then we know that to be a creature at all is to subsist in the divine nature. I mean, that is very strong participatory language. Mm-hmm. And so I think with Calvin, you have another one, but I think without guardrails up, some of the traditions that grew out of Calvin definitely went down the voluntarist and nominalist line. Not purely, but they did impact it and open the door to kind of a suspicion of good participatory ritual and practices that lead to creating almost a void which secularism fills. I mean, that's a lot of history summed up in a statement. But I think that explains why you have what you call contemporary forms of worship and Christian life in evangelical circles, is you have basically a nominalist, voluntarist setting in which you're trying to read the faith in its hyper-secular form.
So if you take, for those who have hung in there, and I want to kind of throw a bone and say, okay, where does the rubber meet the road on this? So if you take something, you may have heard a line like this: if you give, if you say that you have even 1% of anything that you have done to earn your salvation, or to choose your salvation or something like that, if you credit even 1% or even 1/10 of 1% to yourself, you are robbing God of his glory, because it's no matter how small a part, you must say it's 0% and it's all God's grace. Is that a kind of manifestation of this competing wills idea? Number one. And number two, kind of assuming an answer here, but does this not lead to, I guess I'm thinking of people like an Anne Hutchinson in the colonies, where there's no category for preparation or putting oneself in line to hear the gospel, or to hear with God's will, and thus you get a kind of society where today I think this comes out as, well, you can't force anybody to do anything by law because it's so it's all God's grace. You have no control over this. Yeah. And if you do start having laws or anything where you might put people in line with or create more opportunities to hear the gospel, you can't think that way, because there's nothing you can do. God's absolutely free in this. He will, it doesn't matter if you're, you're hungover on drugs on the wrong side of the tracks, or you're in church on Sunday morning, because God's completely free and it's all his will. He'll find you wherever you are. So don't try to, through law or any institution like that, try to encourage people to get off the drugs from the other side of the tracks and into church, because God's free to save whoever he wants.
That's right. It's really what you call it's divine action is everything, human action and human creatureliness is nothing. And so if it's going to be something, it's because God will, inscrutably known only to God's will, and maybe God doesn't know until he wills it, because there's nothing governing God's reasons for willing certain things, no higher nature, no higher thought. So I think for them it's, just, it either happens or it doesn't. And so there's no real place for being a creature, much less culture, much less tradition, ritual, any of the things that had classically made Christian culture what it is and become sort of a embodied tradition that you hand on the deep meanings we're talking about reality and human nature and male, female. For example, I could grow up at a time where it was still an echo of culture, even though it was very secular and modern, where you didn't question that. And that is a hangover from what Christianity did in the West and its contribution. So it left us something good in the culture that we didn't have to question until we kind of moved away from it. So yeah, I think what you're dealing with there is exactly that. I used to tell people, I think it's a good way of putting it. I usually will tell people, how many people in my class, for example, talking to a Christian class, believes that every human being, every baby born is the creation of God. And every one of them will raise their hand. So God is the agent that makes that baby. And then I say, well, how many, that through the normative process of bringing about babies, think that that baby came into being by the human procreative action of its parents? Mm-hmm. And everybody raises their hand. I said, well, what if we put a competition between those? Either God does all of it or the human being does all of it. Would it ever come about? Yeah, sure, God can spontaneously, out of nothing, generate human beings, but God has so gifted the world to become the kind of good that can reproduce life as part of its gift and on its own action, and sometimes never even thinking about God directly and still doing that. Why? Because on the order of creaturely being, we're enacting our creatureliness, which is a good, which we're created to do. There's nothing wrong within the boundaries created for creation to enact as much and as freely as possible the kind of natures we have. And guess what? It's the product of it, life and flourishing, when we do it in accord with the natures and purposes we have. And I think what they think in the realm of the spiritual is that somehow grace and human activity are themselves on the same plane of reality. And so grace somehow, if it's all grace, then it means the human's doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And just like we're all creatures as gift all the way down, we still enact our creatureliness as realities. So why, and this is why I think there is no competition with Galatians and James. Mm-hmm. Because on the order of grace, it's all divine gift, but that grace is enacted on the plane of humanity, which is work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Mm-hmm. And they're both not competing. That's the stage on which it's worked out in the human life and realm. And it is still undergoverned and underwritten by grace. So, the only time that we have to decrease for God to increase is in salvation history, because Messiah is coming on the scene and none of us carry that role. But in terms of us having to not do anything, human preparation and all these things are part of what it means to be a human creature that should be, by its own createdness, orienting itself to God. And it's not a work contributing to salvation. It's you enacting your humanness as one created to worship. And you do it in all kinds of bad ways, but it's in the context of that grace, transfigures, you both as renewing you as a sinner, but also taking your action and bringing it up to become a sacrament again, a life. What is the language of Scripture? Give your whole body to be a living sacrifice. I mean, that's sacramental language, right? Holy and pleasing to God. It doesn't say don't do anything and let God do all of it, that makes no sense. And so what merits salvation? Well, it's not the human action. Right. Because salvation isn't a merited thing, just like what merits you being a human. It's a gift. Mm-hmm. But you still enact it, and God wants you to enact it, just not by eating of the true of knowledge of good and evil, right? That's the no-go zone.
I think the conception analogy is actually brilliant, and I'm jealous that I didn't think of it, but it's a body where that is a both-and situation. And like we were talking about last night, Jared and I had a class, and there's that phrase about the primary sacraments being generally necessary for salvation. And because we've denied this realism, we get so caught up with that language, and the evangelicals cannot wrap their mind around it, because how could you describe something like baptism as generally necessary for salvation if God does all the work?
And so then I'm doing something. I'm contributing to my salvation if I take the sacrament. So therefore it's not actually necessary. That's optional. That's a lot of the byproduct of what came in with
with a competition somehow between the act of baptism and it being a genuine means of grace. And see, the thing is I think prior to this shift, what I think was so beautiful about the Christian world is it had a grasp of creation as sacramental all the way down. Now, I know there can be bad forms of that. I'm not, I learned my lessons from the Reformation. But on the flip side, I think if we don't have a participatory understanding of creation, that it owes all that it is, from whom, through whom, and to him are all things, receiving its very being, and that there is always a surplus. There's something about all creatures that outruns us, and really it points to God even when we don't intend to. But when we do, we become life-giving places, holy places where that goodness permeates creation. We can get a hold of our sacramental understanding much better then, because we realize that there isn't a competition between this creaturely means and sign and the reality that it's participating in Christ, and that it is one of these things where the reality is fully there, not in our imagination. We're not hanging language on it, but it is there. And this is why you have such seriousness in Scripture. Don't you know that those people who've come to this and haven't prepared for it are getting sick? Well, why are they getting sick? It's not because the food was bad, the bread wasn't baked well. It was a spiritual byproduct of real, true participation in this holy reality that these sacraments are bound up with. And my argument is that this is what has been lost. We created something like, what de Lubac will call pure nature, or though that there is nature that is autonomous and we can do what we want with it through technology and meaning. And I think our sacraments oftentimes we relate to that way, that they're just, they're nice ornaments. And even when we use the language of real presence, we don't really have an antenna there. But like, you're using stronger language. Both of you are using stronger language of what's happening there. And I think that's something we do need to retrieve. And I don't think it's against our Reformed interests to do it. I think had the Reformers seen where some of the areas they didn't get to ended up, they would tell us, go back and get the participatory context, because it belongs to true Catholic faith and true Reformed Catholic faith at that. And I think that we should.
So if I could kind of, I know we're almost out of time here, but if I could kind of wrap this up with one question: what about sin? So you might get someone to say, okay, there's a nature. God has a reason and that is above will in a sense. There is reality. All of that, fine, I get it. But how can we as sinful people discern that? Why should we be able to trust our reason, our senses, or anything? So I'll give you the fact that there is really a really real out there. There is a metaphysic. There is that. It's not just arbitrary will. But obviously we disagree on things. So who's right? We're all marred by sin. So how can we know?
I mean, sin is the, and to their credit, even someone like Aquinas or any of them were Augustinians in their understanding of sin and evil, even though they may not look the same way as a voluntarist will. Sin has marred things all the way down, but they've marred a good creation. And I always tell people this, when we're dealing with sin and the creature and how we discern and relate to him, let's take Jesus as the example, right? When he tells you to love your enemy, right? What is he telling you to love about them? Is he trying to love them? They're usually your enemy for a sin reason anyway, right? But they're a fallen, sinful person. Something has marred them to where you probably have every right on a human sinful level of saying, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this person. They're my enemy. Now, it could just be all me, but let's just say it isn't. They're a sinner and they've done me wrong. But why do I still love them? What am I loving about them? They're sinful. They're depraved, right? What am I loving about them? What am I supposed to be loving about them? And it's kind of use Luther's language. If you reach behind a distorted fallen nature and grab hold of the gift they've been given, and you relate to them as the gift they've been given and not to the non-real aspect of them, which is the fallen one, you have discerned something about them and related to that. Now, that does require transformation on our part. Jesus does the same thing with marriage. He said, you've heard divorce come about. And again, I'm not saying that I don't want to get into that whole issue because I know where it can end up. But he still at least recognizes that the final vision of things we can still see from the created order. And we can discern. Now, he's going to help us discern it more fully. We discern echoes of it. But another way of putting it, there is a surplus in creatures, and I know we got to go. There's a surplus in creatures that sin is not allowed to eradicate our creatureliness. It's not a goodness we can hold on to because it's not from us. It's from the Creator. It's sourcing us. We're the ones marring it. But it outruns, it transcends even our fallenness because it's given by God and it's sourced by God. And so because of that, there are aspects of that reality of truth, knowledge, goodness, beauty, and everything else that still gets through even though we distort it. And we can't outrun it even with our fallenness. And that's what draws our appetites to not be satisfied with creaturely things, even though we can't of our own resources find, as the book of Acts says, we're groping around, we're close to it, but we haven't quite gotten it. So we create a temple to an unknown God, recognizing there must be some source like the one that nothing else can quite address. And yet we don't know its name. So I think we can know a lot of things without fully knowing its name. And then we need a St. Paul to come in and say, you were groping in this one you live and move and have your being. And you were right to even have a temple to this one you don't know. But today I'm going to show you this one has a name.
Yeah. I like the way you put that, outrunning or outrunning our sinfulness. And I think of just the simple idea. Adolf Hitler loved his mother.
Yeah.
There's just
couldn't eradicate those
outpacing, no matter how much sin. There's this outpacing of love for another human being, right? A tenderness of there that outpaces even the most, some of the most historic evils, right? So I really appreciate that language.
Yeah.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
So, CJ, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I do. Well, I appreciate the time that you spent with us, Tom. I mean, these are, the more I understand, I mean, this is a lot of what this podcast has been is introducing some of the Anglican themes to new audiences. And so
nice.
The thing that I've discovered, being on this journey myself, is how much these seemingly distant conversations actually pertain to the everyday life of our religious inclinations. They really do. You can see it showing up everywhere. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so that's why it's important to think through these things as abstract and as difficult and complex as they might be. It is important to at least have a rudimentary understanding of what's going on behind the scenes because they play into the sacraments, the liturgy, our own spiritual development, our own understanding of the grace of God and the role of our own works in the development of us as humans and as saved Christians. So with all that said, I really appreciate the time. I hope everyone listening to this, please go to YouTube and like and subscribe. We want to grow this channel this year. I always hate when podcast hosts say this, but now it's my turn to say it. So that's it. Like and subscribe, share the podcast, and we will see you in another week.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for joining us this week on Canterbury Trails. If you like what you hear, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing on whatever platform you're hearing us. Stay tuned for more weekly episodes, and we'll see you next time on the Canterbury Trails.